Dear colleagues, good day, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this Development Dialogue event on human security in the decade of action through a gender equality lens. My name is Peter Batchelor, and I'm the head of the UNDP Crisis Bureau Policy and Engagement team based in New York, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you all today to this event. We have people joining us from all around the world. That was a nice introduction. Thank you very much. So yes, I was about to say we have people joining us from all around the world, already more than 100 participants, which is great. So just to remind everybody that today's event is supported by interpretation in English, French, and Arabic. And you'll see the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So please do feel free to click on that button for the language that you prefer. And also just to remind you that today's event is being recorded as well. So before we get going, we're going to start with a short video about human security. I'm sure many of you are aware of the concept of human security. It's been around for many, many years, and is a concept that we will be discussing at length over the next 90 minutes or so. But before we do that, just to get everybody warmed up, we're going to show a short video about human security, and then we'll get into the substance of our event for today. So with that, let me ask our colleagues, technical colleagues, to help run the video, please.
No puedo transitar libremente como todo ciudadano de cualquier país lo haga.
Today's complex and interconnected challenges impede efforts to eradicate poverty and promote shared prosperity.
Thank you very much. And with that, let's start our session today on human security in the decade of action through a gender equality lens. Before we get going with the substance of our conversation today, we thought we would do a quick poll, a Zoom poll, to find out where you are coming from today and which different organizations you're representing. So first of all, we're going to have the poll on what region we're connecting from. So if you could quickly click on whichever region you're coming from. Do we have the results of the poll one yet? Okay, so it looks as if the predominant number of people joining us today are from Asia. Well, that's very interesting. And it looks like we already have nearly 120 participants with us today. So that's great. So thank you for that. Let's move now to the next poll. And this is the type of organization we're representing. So again, if you could click on the type of organization that you're representing today. We'll just give it 1 or 2 more minutes, and then we'll ask our colleagues to give us the results of the poll. And if we could see the results of the poll now. Okay, so a nice even spread between all different types of organizations, from government officials, civil society, academia, the private sector well represented here today, and then of course the UN, IFIs, and multilateral development banks, the largest, so around 48%. So great, well thank you again for joining us, and let's get started now. So obviously today's topic is about human security through a gender equality lens, and of course we're talking about countries that are in crisis or fragile situations which face many challenges, including, of course, the issue of gender equality. And of course, we know that the COVID pandemic has exacerbated further many of these gender equality issues, including issues like gender-based violence, the triple burden faced by women, the lack of social protection, and their concentration in the informal sector. So to tackle these multidimensional threats to gender equality, we need a holistic approach that acknowledges the links between gender equality and fragility. And this, of course, is where the concept of human security comes in and is most useful. As I mentioned before, the concept of human security has been around for many, many years, and we'll hear a bit more about that shortly. But what is interesting, of course, is that as a result of the COVID pandemic, there's been a re-interest, I guess, in the concept of human security. And the fact that human security provides a very useful conceptual framework for tackling global challenges and also the issue of gender equality. And so as we look forward now to the last 9 years of the decade of action, of course, accelerating human security progress towards a more equal society will also obviously include the realization of women's rights across the economic, political, and social spheres. And of course, we need to do more in terms of investments in gender equality with a stronger commitment to partnership. UNDP is at the forefront of these efforts to strengthen gender equality, particularly in fragile and crisis settings. And we're working actively with many of you to advance peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. To accelerate these efforts in countries affected by fragility and crisis, UNDP has launched a gender and crisis facility earlier this year to tackle some of the persistent drivers of gender equality in crisis settings. And of course, also to challenge the gender norms that drive both inequality and fragility. This gender and crisis facility, which is just starting its work now, will focus on 2 key accelerators of transformational change in fragile and crisis contexts. 1, women's economic empowerment, and 2, women's leadership and participation. And we'll hear more about those topics later today as well. We hope that today's event will help inform the future activities of our collective work on gender and crisis. And of course, we also hope that today's event will be useful for all the different organizations that are joining us here today. Let us now start with our first 2 presenters. The first one is Ms. Hitomi Kubo from the United Nations Trust Fund for Human Security, who will speak on the linkage between human security, gender equality, and women's empowerment from the experience of the Trust Fund. Ms. Hitomi, thank you for joining us today. And maybe a question to you as you start your presentation. The Trust Fund has financed projects that translate the human security approach into practical actions to provide concrete and sustainable benefits to vulnerable people and communities. From your experience, can you share with us what you see as the biggest link between human security and gender equality? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter, and greetings to everyone who's participating today, and many thanks also to UNDP for organizing this very timely event within the development dialogues. I will do my best to respond to that question. What I'd like to do in the time that I have this morning is to highlight, in fact, key attributes of the human security approach that contribute to a systematic application of strategies to advance gender equality and women's empowerment across different types of programming. And I'm of course drawing on lessons from the UN Trust Fund for Human Security over the past 15 years, since we are so fortunate to have representatives from some of these programs as well as other programs. I won't be giving necessarily concrete examples, but really building on the lessons from the fund over this time. First slide, please. So as both a concept and an approach, human security proposes sort of a new way of thinking about security and insecurity, as well as guiding very concrete action to address and really prioritize addressing inequality and marginalization within development, peace building, and all types of programming. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as a people-centered approach, it places the survival, livelihood, and dignity of people as the very fundamental basis for having prosperous, stable, and just societies, acknowledging that people are really generally faced with multiple and interconnected and often compounding challenges, particularly in fragile contexts, and that therefore there needs to be an emphasis on prevention and preparedness so that shocks and crises do not undo years of development and or generate conditions of severe deprivation for specific groups. Ultimately, really is a practical framework, though, a practical operational framework to develop policies, programs, and tools to analyze and respond to complex challenges through people-centered, comprehensive, prevention-oriented, and context-specific action, as well as through protection and empowerment strategies, which I'll discuss a bit further on. So it's really useful to think of human security as sort of an umbrella framework, a methodology for analysis, planning, implementation, and even M&E, guided by these principles I just outlined, and under which a host of other tools and approaches can be encapsulated, including, of course, those to advance gender equality and women's empowerment. So in what ways does the human security approach concretely and systematically do this? Well, we know that inequality is not just limited to disparities in income and wealth. It's really the result of the interaction of identity markers like race and gender and others with the economic, social, geographic, and political context in which a person lives. And it, of course, manifests in the extent to which people have access to resources, how they are supported by social protection systems. It's revealed in the degree of their inclusion and participation in formal and informal processes. And it's often something that accumulates over time to create structural or institutionalized barriers for certain groups. And since people often experience multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, it's important to consider this intersectionality, sort of how personal attributes, lived experience, and the environment can be compounding to create unique modes of discrimination that are very difficult to unpack and therefore also difficult to address. So thinking about how we advance gender equality and women's empowerment requires a really nuanced understanding of the physical, social, and institutional environment, as well as what these different identity markers mean in any given context. Next slide, please. So the human security approach is really well suited to unpacking this type of complexity. It combines a multidimensional situational analysis with a very in-depth localized analysis of the specific needs, vulnerabilities, and capacities of various subgroups within a population. The situational analysis sort of provides us really that comprehensive assessment of risks and impacts across the 7 dimensions of human security, which are listed on this slide, enabling us to really start to think about how they're interconnected and where our entry points can be. And this is across sectors, but also from the global to the local. So we see with COVID that we have cascading impacts across sectors, health to the economy, to education, etc., but also how a global event can interact with interpersonal factors like sexual and gender-based violence to exacerbate insecurity for women and girls and others. Another aspect of this analysis that's very important is really this risk-informed perspective. We know one of the greatest obstacles to advancing equality within the context of sustainable development or peace building, and of course, also the challenge to advancing sustainable development itself, is the continuous onslaught of shocks and crises, large and small, that really exacerbate insecurity for people. So understanding these risks and really having that risk-informed perspective is fundamental in two ways. First, it helps us have a forward-looking lens, a longer-term trajectory, so we can focus on root causes, which is really essential to trying to reverse trends in inequalities that have developed over time. And second, because those who are already experiencing discrimination are more likely to be exposed to risk and less protected from them, it's really essential to detecting those areas where the risks are greatest, so we don't overlook very highly vulnerable groups. A third attribute is really this very contextualized approach where we're really trying to get down into the understanding the realities on the ground. This helps us elaborate the cultural context a little bit more, understanding values, traditions, and customs that have a real, albeit sometimes subconscious, impact on determining roles, responsibilities, and expectations of men and women in a society. And digging deeper into these perceptions and beliefs is very much a hallmark of the human security approach, but also really important for solutions that can start to transform opportunities, institutions, and expectations pertaining to gender. And then fourthly, and I won't go too much into this, but looking at the needs, vulnerabilities, and capacities. So current status, potential vulnerability, but also the capacities that exist already at the local level. Building on what exists at the local level, such as engaging and supporting women's collectives and cooperatives, really provides the foundation for empowerment-based approaches, promotes more active participation of women and girls, and creates opportunities for new types of leadership to emerge. Next slide, please. So if we move then now from the analytical to the planning and implementation, a few other key attributes that are very important include, again, identifying entry points for collective action. So as I mentioned earlier, the multidimensional analysis sort of really helps us identify those entry points that are going to have are most likely to have positive impacts in multiple dimensions of people's lives. So when we look, and of course this is context specific, but when we look across human security programming, we see that entry points such as economic empowerment, equity in education, and promoting engagement of women and girls in decision making are really key. I won't belabor the second point, which is participatory and inclusive approaches. I think this is something that's quite requisite for all of our work, but again, something that's been a foundational element of the human security approach. A real contribution, I think, from our perspective is really on protection and empowerment strategies. So this is enabling the development of responses that combine legal, policy, and institutional measures with capacity building and community-based initiatives to promote equality and access, opportunities, and outcomes. And bringing together these two elements of protection and empowerment in a mutually reinforcing manner is really essential. We can imagine that we can have laws that promote gender equality, but if we don't, for example, address social norms, attitudes, etc., that inhibit women from accessing those opportunities, we'll have limited success in advancing gender equality. And similarly, promoting community-based initiatives without ensuring a policy environment that's conducive will also limit the extent of the outcomes we can reach. So considering these two in tandem is really important. And then lastly, of course, I think this is something we all aim to do more, is ensuring that we are measuring really tangible improvements in people's lives, but also ensuring that our indicators are tracking progress towards longer term and broader gender equality and women's empowerment targets over time, even beyond any particular initiative we're working in. So while this is quite a quick overview, what I think is important to emphasize is that more systematic application of the human security approach will naturally support greater focus and emphasis on promoting gender equality and women's empowerment, as well as providing an umbrella framework under which we can mainstream gender-sensitive approaches across sectoral strategies. So I hope I've answered that question, Peter, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kubo, for an excellent presentation, and I think gives a really good overview of the concept and its usefulness, as you said, both analytically, but also in terms of helping with practical programming. Let's move now to our next speaker, Mr. Heriberto Tapia from the UNDP Human Development Report. Hello, Heriberto. And you will be talking about a new report that the Human Development Report Office is producing on the concept of human security vis-a-vis current global challenges. And as we hear from you, Heriberto, if you could tell us a little bit about this report that you're doing and how the new approach to human security can help us to address gender equality issues, particularly in crisis and fragile settings. Over to you, Heriberto. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for the invitation. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. I'm gonna put my timer. So yes, first let me tell you a little bit about what we are doing. We are writing a special report on human security. Something that is interesting to note is that the human security concept was born in a human development report in the Human Development Report 1994. So, and now we came to the conclusion that we needed to revisit it, the concept and its applicability. And the main reason for this is because we think we are facing a unique moment in history because of the high levels of risk that we are facing and the distinct nature of these risks. So in this slide, I'm showing you some of the main risks, some of them linked to the Anthropocene. This is climate change, the loss of biodiversity, zoonotic diseases. Also, there are risks that are coming through technologies, fraud, how technologies are affecting our lives in different ways, cybercrime. There are new challenges in health. There are new challenges also in violent conflict situations, and certainly, and this is something that I want to stress today, there are many risks that are coming from inequalities, different forms of inequalities, and one of them is precisely gender inequality. And the way we are thinking about this new risk is that they have certain features. They are not only new to some extent, they are not only very significant in their potential impact to people's lives, but they also have certain characteristics. And one of them is that in general, they cannot be solved by just pushing more development. They need a particular approach. Some of them are actually a byproduct of development, or they have been entrenched in the way we have been developing. And this is particularly the case of inequalities. So countries have continued to develop, but there are certain type of inequality, and certainly gender inequality is been there. The other issue is that some of the security approaches that we have been producing to deal with this risk might not be working, and therefore we need to think of something different. And I think in this context, the human security concept and the human security lens to policy, along the lines that Hitomi was talking, could be hugely important. So just very briefly, how gender equality can be part of this approach. Well, first, talking about it, so including it as part of the key topics that we are going to be discussing. In this case, inequality and gender inequality is the gender component is going to be central. Second, acknowledging the different dimensions of insecurities and inequalities that are happening in different contexts. Third, identifying women as actors and not as victims. And this is something that we expect to be very strong in our report. That means that when we come to the discussion about policies, women also have a voice, that it's important defining what to do. Fourth, bringing to the forefront the experiences of women, and in particular to see what is in the structure. So the inequalities in power in society. And finally, dealing with the different intersectionalities in a more explicit way. So now going to your question, and this is just to motivate the discussion because I cannot answer it. So in the context of conflict situation, there are plenty of these elements to be highlighted. And along all the main elements of the human security definition here, we are highlighting just few, the easier ones in terms of the freedom from want, which reflects the privations that women experience under conflict and fragility situation, and also the freedom from fear, that this is about the integrity, the physical integrity of women, but we could also go to many issues related to dignity. So what we are doing is to try to map some of these elements and to try to see to what extent we have been able to progress along all these lines in freedom of want, freedom from fear, and also in terms of dignity, and then try to come up with approaches that where women as agents and not as victims can be part of the solution. I'm sorry, my time is up, but this is just to give you a flavor of how we are thinking about gender in the context of the Human Security Report. I'm happy to then be part of the conversation. Over.
Thank you very much, Heriberto. That's great. And that gives us, I think, a very nice backdrop to our conversation today as well. Nicely complementing also what you told me you shared with us. So thank you for that. Colleagues, let's now move to our panelists. Sorry, I'm just going to put my video on. Sorry, there we go. So let's now move to our panelists, and we're very delighted to have joining us today distinguished panelists from 3 countries, from Mali, from Haiti, and from Yemen. These are colleagues who have been implementing projects with UNDP on human security and gender equality. So this is the view from the ground, the voices from the ground. We're going to start with Mr. Baba Mahmoud Arbi from the Ministry of Youth and Sports of Mali, then Mr. Jerry Chandler from the Directorate of Civil Protection in Haiti, and then lastly, Ms. Sabah Bakir from the All Foundation in Yemen. And as I say, they will each be sharing with us the experiences of their work on the ground in those 3 countries. But for each of the panelists, what we've asked them to do is to share with us the human security and gender issues that were addressed by their specific projects or interventions, how these interventions were hopefully successful in transforming gender relations, and some of the challenges that were also faced by the different projects. With that, let me hand over to Mr. Baba Arbi from Mali, who will introduce himself and then play a short video and then share with us the experience of Mali. Dr. Mali, you have the floor, please.
Alors, ok, merci beaucoup. Je suis très ravi de retrouver donc vraiment la réunion enfin, parce que ça fait un moment je ne suivais pas, mais c'était avec la technique. Donc aujourd'hui, comme disons donc au Mali, depuis 2012, nous étions confrontés à une crise sécuritaire donc très ardue, surtout dans les régions du Nord, et plus après, donc vers les régions du centre aussi, qui aujourd'hui, Ségou et Mopti aussi, qui connaissent vraiment des difficultés d'insécurité, donc à partir des injections des groupes armés et des groupes terroristes et djihadistes qui sont là et qui font vraiment beaucoup d'exactions, des violations des droits humains, des viols des femmes, des jeunes filles. Et surtout, ce que nous connaissons aujourd'hui, donc avec cette pratique, c'est le déplacement des femmes, des jeunes, des hommes, des enfants, soit dans les pays ou à l'extérieur du pays, dans les pays voisins, pour chercher vraiment là où c'est soumis. Il y a aussi donc la perte et l'abandon des moyens de production, parce que tous ceux qui se déplacent aujourd'hui se déplacent en laissant tous leurs moyens de production, en laissant leurs maisons, en laissant leur bétail, parfois en laissant tout ce qu'ils ont comme du bien. Et surtout l'inaccessibilité des services sociaux, parce que quand on parle de déplacement, c'est des gens qui vont se retrouver quelque part où il y a vraiment beaucoup d'inaccessibilité par rapport aux services sociaux de base, donc c'est des souffrances très... Donc, ça a amené à ce qu'avec le PNUD, donc après le retour un peu de la paix, quand les régions du Nord ont été libérées par les djihadistes, donc aujourd'hui, nous avons initié des projets avec le PNUD pour pouvoir au moins ramener les gens chez eux, que les femmes puissent retourner et puissent continuer à travailler. Et c'est dans ce cadre que malgré cette citation, on a initié ce qu'on appelait le programme d'appui à la sécurité humaine en vue du renforcement de la résilience des femmes et des jeunes dans les régions nord du Mali. Et cela a apporté donc vraiment beaucoup d'espoir, de sorte que les jeunes et les femmes ont pu se relever. Il convient de dire que cette initiative nous a amené à passer par une sensibilisation des communautés à la base, pour leur pleine adhésion aux activités, à ce qu'eux-mêmes nous proposent ce qu'il faut, ce qu'ils peuvent faire et ce qui va tout de suite les amener à se tenir debout pour pouvoir faire ça. Et donc cela nous a amené donc à faire de sorte que les communautés puissent se parler entre eux et puissent proposer et puissent dire voilà ce que nous voudrons. Donc le projet était basé dans le cadre donc non seulement des activités génératrices de revenus, mais surtout basé sur la paix et la cohésion sociale afin que donc on puisse ramener donc dans le cœur donc et les esprits des femmes et de ces jeunes meurtris donc par la présence de ces. Par ailleurs, il y avait aussi donc l'implication, la responsabilisation. Donc, il fallait impliquer depuis le départ les femmes et les jeunes et les responsabiliser, tous les acteurs locaux, parce que c'était la société civile. Il fallait faire que ces communautés puissent faire de telle sorte qu'ils puissent avoir une réponse vraiment à cette crise multifonctionnelle qui est essentielle, et de faire avoir la confiance entre eux et le PNUD et nous, donc au niveau donc du ministère de la Jeunesse qui a pu apporter à ce niveau. Donc pendant cette chose, il y avait eu une mobilisation massive des femmes parce qu'on a voulu aller vers les jeunes, mais on a vu que les jeunes filles et les femmes ont été plus intéressées donc à cette initiative de résilience, et c'est ce qui nous a amené donc à nous appuyer sur les femmes et faire de sorte que c'est que les femmes, plus comme c'est elles qui sont les premières victimes donc de toutes ces exactions, on a pu les réunir et puis, quelle que soit leur communauté, ils ont pu se réunir et puis faire de sorte qu'ils puissent revenir et de sorte qu'ils nous identifient des activités génératrices de revenus qui étaient posées sur l'agriculture, sur l'élevage, l'embouche bovine, comme je dis, sur le maraîchage et sur l'artisanat, donc en confectionnant donc tout ceci, on a pu les mobiliser aussi parce que tout simplement les femmes généralement reposent sur elles, et ce sont ces rencontres périodiques dont nous profitons pour faire passer le message. Donc voilà un peu comment cette initiative a pu faire de sorte que aujourd'hui les femmes ont beaucoup pu bénéficier donc de cette initiative et on a beaucoup des activités génératrices de revenus qui vivent aujourd'hui et qui font de sorte que les femmes ont pu être donc résiliées ainsi que les jeunes. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Arby, very much. And thank you for sharing with us the elements of the program. I understand we have a short video of the project in Mali that we'd like to share with you. So if I could ask the technical colleagues to please play that video, please.
Ridinga kata fa bayra no yer gojjina yo ho ero dam yer koysal barka ero dam gis ino yer gojjina yi har yam mo goy har yer goydima koynde jina amadou gar. Au moment où nous avons commencé à souffler après cette rébellion qui nous a déviés de tout ce que on faisait pour nous-mêmes. Donc nos jeunes, ils étaient là à la merci des narcotrafiquants, à la merci des mouvements armés. Franchement, ils étaient désœuvrés. Donc, ce projet leur a permis vraiment de reprendre espoir, de s'occuper à des projets, des activités génératrices de revenus, car les ateliers qui étaient fermés ont repris vie. Des chantiers fermés ont repris. Donc, franchement, le projet, tout ce que je peux dire, vraiment, il était le bienvenu.
C'est un projet qui, dans sa première phase, a regroupé l'ensemble des organisations de la société civile, les jeunes, les femmes et les fêtières, sur d'abord un diagnostic sur les problématiques liées à la crise.
Tontonia Sabere, Yerger Malak Dom, Ayaka Tontona Sangum Bere. Yerwana Guider, Casimini de Bois. Yara insa almoir, yara insa table, yara insa coiffeuse, yara insa tite. Yara kindes goy fora, yara ba goydi. Mera sinka dang, har yar kata du pinit ka kata faber.
C'est grâce à ces projets-là qu'il y a des filles aujourd'hui qui travaillent pour eux-mêmes. Et dans ça, ils enlèvent la scolarité de leurs enfants. C'est grâce à ce projet-là. On remercie beaucoup le PNUD. Parce qu'il y a même des filles victimes quand leurs maris sont morts dans la guerre. Ils sont là.
Moi, je suis satisfait parce que ce projet-là est venu nous appuyer. Ce n'est pas parce qu'il y a beaucoup d'électricité ici à Toronto. Non. Non. Mais le coût de l'électricité, parce que c'est les appareils qui fonctionnent 24 sur 24 sur les coûts d'électricité. Bon, avec l'arrivée de ce projet, même si nous devons payer peut-être 100 000 francs à l'EDEM, on va payer que 30 000 francs. Toute la journée, nos matériels sont sous solaire, sauf la nuit. Donc, ça a carrément diminué nos dépenses.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arby, and thank you for also sharing with us the experiences of the project in Mali. Let's now turn to our next speaker, who is Mr. Jerry Chandler, who's the Director General of the Directorate of Civil Protection in Haiti. You're very welcome, Mr. Chandler. Thank you for joining us today, and we have now the chance to hear from you about the project in Haiti. Over to you, please.
Hello, I don't know if you can hear me.
We can. Thank you, Mr. Chandler. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Very good. Et c'est avec beaucoup de plaisir que je dis bonjour à tout le monde et que j'ai la chance de participer avec vous dans ce webinaire que je pense qu'il est extrêmement important sur un sujet justement qui est d'une importance capitale pour nous tous. La sécurité humaine est particulièrement orientée par rapport aux gens en Haïti est un point extrêmement important pour nous. Vous savez que Haïti est un pays particulier au niveau de l'Amérique et au niveau de la Caraïbe et nous avons nous avons certains problèmes structurels, sociopolitiques et nous avons plusieurs niveaux justement auxquels il faut faire face. Donc de ce fait, et rapidement je dois dire que je suis personnellement responsable de la protection civile en Haïti et à travers la protection civile, avec l'appui du PNUD, nous avons récemment mis sur pied un projet qui nous a permis d'adresser le problème de la sécurité humaine en mettant un accent particulier sur le genre et l'égalité de genre. Donc, en termes de contexte rapide, je peux dire que Haïti est particulier dans la mesure où nous sommes très sujets et nous sommes très exposés aux catastrophes naturelles, et que ce soit les cyclones, les ouragans, et qui n'arrêtent pas d'augmenter en fréquence et en intensité. Et nous savons que pendant les dernières années, à cause du changement climatique, nous avons réalisé, les scientifiques ont réalisé que l'intensité de ces phénomènes va croissant et nous avons des exemples. En 2004, nous avons eu l'ouragan Jeanne. Haïti a subi l'ouragan Jeanne qui a causé pratiquement 3000 morts et qui a causé des dégâts vraiment énormes à hauteur de 41 millions de dollars. Une douzaine d'années après, soit en 2016, nous avons eu l'ouragan Matthew qui a ravagé la presqu'île sud du pays et qui a causé encore plus de dégâts et a mis en danger pratiquement 2 millions de personnes. Donc, ce qui fait que, comme j'ai dit, les problèmes sont multiples et variés. En plus des ouragans et justement de leur cortège de malheurs, nous devons aussi faire face au tremblement de terre, quand vous n'êtes pas sans savoir que Haïti a subi le fameux tremblement de terre de 2010 et que de plus en plus, la menace sismique, elle est là, elle est précise et elle est de plus en plus, je dirais, elle se précise de plus en plus. Donc, nous sommes obligés aussi de faire face et de prendre ceci en compte par rapport aux travaux que nous faisons. Donc, en termes fort de tout ceci, et comme j'ai dit, les effets des changements climatiques, comme ils ne sont pas sélectifs en termes de genre, donc nous avons pu voir à travers les études que il y a beaucoup plus de femmes qui sont impactées à tête. Et il faut dire que la population haïtienne est constituée de plus de 60 à 60% de femmes. Donc, on a plus de femmes que d'hommes, longtemps plus de femmes que d'hommes. Et dans les foyers et dans les foyers de manière générale, les femmes sont le moteur justement qui fait fonctionner justement l'économie de manière globale. Et il faut dire que nous avons identifié aussi des barrières socio-culturelles qui limite la participation des femmes dans les activités, ce qui est encore plus compliqué dans les situations de désastre et dans les situations de catastrophe. Donc, de ce fait, et comme pour citer quelques exemples simples, nous savons que l'accès à l'eau, l'accès aux services de base, comme vient de dire notre collègue du Mali, sont des problèmes, et particulièrement en situation de désastre, ça devient encore plus crucial, vu que justement à ce moment-là, nous nous retrouvons avec des populations exposées qui, justement, sont obligées de se débrouiller et qui se retrouvent avec des biais. Donc, la femme se retrouve à chercher de l'eau, à chercher les services de base pour la famille et n'est pas forcément prise en compte dans les actions et dans les activités de réponse à l'urgence et de redressement. Donc, de ce fait, comme je dis, là, nous avons fait malheureusement aussi le constat que, de manière générale, dans les politiques publiques, la femme n'est pas forcément adressée. Il faut noter qu'il y a quand même un redressement depuis quelques années au niveau, je dirais, gouvernemental pour pouvoir prendre ceci en compte. L'égalité, je dirais, la parité de sexe est prise en compte aussi, mais de manière pratique, nous sommes en train il y a quand même encore un combat et une demande justement pour la représentation des femmes dans les sphères de décision et aussi la prise en compte justement du genre au moment justement de faire des activités, au moment de diriger justement des activités d'urgence et de réponse. Maintenant, en termes d'action rapidement en termes d'actions qui ont été prises et qui ont été entreprises, nous pouvons dire qu'avec le support du ministère de l'Éducation et aussi le support du ministère de la Condition féminine, nous avons travaillé sur l'élaboration et la validation de certains modules de formation en gestion de risque et de désastre qui doivent être et qui sont en passe de validation au niveau du système scolaire. Et dans ces modules, la prise en compte justement du genre est justement mise en exergue. Nous avons aussi travaillé sur notre réseau de volontaires, car la protection civile est principalement constituée de volontaires. Nous en avons à peu près 2500 à travers le pays et la plupart, comme encore toujours en termes de représentativité, nous avons quand même une bonne représentativité. Près de 40% de ces volontaires sont des femmes, justement. Donc là, nous sommes en train de pousser et d'encourager justement l'implication et la participation des femmes dans les activités directement. Bien entendu, nous sommes aussi en train de travailler de pousser par rapport à une action de communication au grand public par rapport aux droits des femmes et par rapport aux actions justement à mener et à la prise en compte justement du genre. Et enfin, ce qu'il faut dire aussi, c'est que nous avons aussi travaillé sur encourager la mise sur pied d'activités communautaires et à travers les organisations qui sont dirigées, leadées par des femmes, de manière à ce que justement il y ait une prise en compte et il y ait une implication beaucoup plus, je dirais, beaucoup plus active justement de la femme dans les situations de désastre. Donc, en termes de conclusion, je peux dire rapidement que la femme est au cœur et au centre de nos activités sociales et économiques. Donc là, maintenant, il nous faut vraiment prendre des actions pour que ceci soit je dirais, vraiment de manière pratique, prise en compte. Et comme on dit, sortir de la parole et aller aux actions. Et c'est là que justement, nous autres, au niveau de la protection civile, nous sommes en train de prendre des dispositions et prendre des mesures pour pouvoir favoriser. Et ceci, nous l'avons fait heureusement. Et encore, nous remercions encore le PNUD. Heureusement, grâce à ce projet qui nous a permis de voir et de mettre en exergue cette disparité. Donc là, nous sommes en train de travailler dessus. C'est sûr que ça va prendre du temps, mais nous nous y appelons et nous pensons qu'avec justement des encouragements et justement le financement nécessaire, nous pourrons avancer dans la bonne direction. Je vous remercie tous pour votre attention et je suis quand même disponible pour les questions subséquentes. Over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chanda, and we'll come back shortly with some questions for you. But let us now turn to our final panelist, Ms. Sabah Badri Bakir from Yemen, who is the Executive Manager for the All Foundation. Ms. Bakir, you have the floor, please. Over to you.
Allô? Oui, non, je parle à quelqu'un. Allô? Allô? Bonjour.
أنا اسمي صباح بدري من اليمن، المدير التنفيذي لمؤسسة For All Foundation. قبل ما أبدأ العرض حابة أني أعطي مثل. لو حصل للإنسان كسر بالإمكان الذهاب إلى الطبيب وعمل الجبس أو التكبير ويكون صحته كويسة في فترة زمنية معينة. ولكن إذا حصل عندنا تمزق في العضل فهنا بيحتاج لنا وقت طويل لعملية إن إحنا ناخذ إعادة النسيج داخل العضلات، وهذا ما حصل في اليمن. حصل تمزق كبير جدا وذلك بسبب وجود الأحزاب الطائفية، أيضا التوزيع الجغرافي، هذا شمالي هذا جنوبي، وهذا النسيج الاجتماعي يحتاج وقت طويل لإعادتها. Next. إياكو next. لا عنده صح؟ عنده. طيب. No. Yes. في هذه الحالة حبيت أن أنا نتكلم عن التحديات ومن أهم الشرائح اللي حاولنا أن احنا نسلط الضوء عليها في هذه الجلسة، وهي النساء والتحديات التشالنجز الرئيسية اللي مرت فيها المرأة اليمنية في السبع سنوات الأخيرة. وبنحدد السبع سنوات الأخيرة منها فقدان الأمن المادي والاقتصادي والنفسي، النزوح وهي انتقال المرأة من منطقة إلى منطقة جديدة، برغم أن المرأة في اليمن يعني ممنوع تسافر إلا بوجود محرم، فكيف قدرت أنها تنتقل إلى منطقة أخرى وتتحمل وتتكيف هي وأبنائها وتتحمل المسؤولية في منطقة أخرى. أيضا بسبب الحروب يعني فقدت العوائل الأسرهم اليوم در للدخل في البيت، بما أنه يا إما أنه أصيب أنه توفى أو أنه أصاب بإعاقة. وكمان جائحة كورونا أتت مفاجأة واللي عاقت الناس لممارستها في الأعمال وانهيار أغلب المشاريع المدرة بالدخل خصوصا للنساء. ارتفاع حالة العنف القائم على النوع الاجتماعي. إلى جانب هذه التحديات كان في فعلا تحديات قبل الحرب بشكل أساسي، أولا اللي هي القيود الاجتماعية والثقافية والعادات والتقاليد، عدم أنه منعت المرأة من خروجها في اليمن للتعليم بسبب عدم وجود وجود المدارس، أنها مثلا تجيب الماء من طرقات بعيدة في عدم توفر الحماية، ثقافة العيب أن تذهب المرأة إلى المحاكم أو إلى النيابة إذا حدث لها عنف من الزوج، ما فيش مستشفيات في مناطق الريفية والقرى، وعدم وجود فرص لاكتساب النساء المهارات المهنية أو الحياتية. وفعلا معنا كمان المشكلة الأساسية كثرة الإنجاب أو الخلفة والفقر الفادح وعدم وجود رعاية للمرأة والمجتمع لأنه مجتمع ذكوري. وننتقل نكست. فأتى برنامج أو مشروع UNDP تم تمويلنا في إحدى المشروع هذا الذي بنتكلم فيه، نعرض تجربتنا لمعالجة هذه التحديات بقدر المستطاع. فهذه كان معنا مشروع مع الأمم المتحدة الممول من الحكومة اليابانية، مشروع برنامج تعزيز القدرة على الصمود من خلال تحسين سبل العيش والأمن الإنساني. هذا كان من المشروع بيمر بعدة مكونات. أولا توفير فرص عادلة، لا نقصد بالفرص العادلة فقط إن إحنا نعمل التكافؤ، ولكن الفرص العادلة في المساواة بين الذكور والإناث، تنمية القدرات المهنية والمهارات الحياتية. لكي نصل للأمن الإنساني قدمنا برامج في مجال الحماية وتقديم الدعم النفسي والقانوني وتفعيل مساحات آمنة، وذلك من أجل الاستقرار. وصلنا للتنمية الإنسانية وهي التي من خلالها تم تعزيز السلام والتماسك الاجتماعي من خلال المشاريع المدرة بالدخل. نكست. عشان نعالج قضايا الأمن الإنساني والنوع الاجتماعي لازم نحن نمشي بثلاث مستويات، نتحرك بثلاث مستويات، لا يمكن أن احنا ندخل في المستوى الثالث قبل أن نصل للأول. العمل مع المؤثرين وهم الأساس في اللجان المجتمعية والشيوخ والسلطات المحلية، من ثم المجتمعات والأسر والأقارب حتى يكونوا داعمين للمرأة لأنها تدخل في الفئات المستهدفة. إذا بدأنا بالأسرة أو بدأنا بالفئات المستهدفة مباشرة، للأسف الشديد قد ممكن نجد تحدي كبير وهو المجتمع أو الأسر أو السلطات المحلية. نكست. لمعالجة هذه القضايا والأمن الإنساني والنوع الاجتماعي تتم من خلال عدة نقاط. أول شيء لازم نعمل بناء قدرات الكادر، وهذا الأساس الذي بدأ فيها في المشروع بقضايا النوع الإنساني والنوع الاجتماعي. زيادة وعي المجتمع المحلي حول حقوق النساء. في المرحلة الثالثة وهي طرق نشر المعلومات والمواد المتعلقة بقضايا العنف والحقوق. المرحلة الأخيرة وهي المهمة جدا وهو إشراك الرجل في عملية التوعية والتعاطي معها كشريك محارب للعنف ضد التمييز للمرأة. من ضمن المشروع كان في معنا الوصول للدعم والمساعدة القانونية، يعتبر أداة قوية وهي من خلال التطبيق. تم تدشين تطبيق مزودي الخدمات النفسية والقانونية تكون سهلة الوصول للنساء خصوصا لعدم معرفتها من أين. من خلال المعاناة انتقلنا إلى الإبداع. نكست. وهي من المشاريع اللي تحولت الأدوار التقليدية للمرأة من دور المطبخ والحياكة والنظرة السلبية لنفسها، انتقلت إلى الأدوار الحديثة والإيجابية. نكست. الإيجابية وعدم استسلامها للتحديات وفتح المشاريع صغيرة لدعم أسرهم وأنفسهم. هذه المشاريع فعلا انتقلت هذه الأدوار من صنع الطبخ إلى صناعة الأغذية، واستطاعت المرأة أن تدخل سوق العمل، ومن التصوير إلى صيانة الهاتف المحمول، افتتاح مصانع الخياطة، التصاميم، وفي أكثر من تجارب كثيرة. وخلال انخراطها إحنا مشكلتنا في اليمن كانت عدم وجود المشاركة المجتمعية. من خلال هذا المشروع استطعنا أن نصل إلى هذه النساء إلى 1700 شاب وشابة بالمناصفة متساوية. 1200 استطاعوا فتح المشاريع، 600 امرأة صار لها مشروع صغير. استطاعت الأمم المتحدة من خلال المشروع أنها تبني قدراتنا كمؤسسات محلية من خلال التدريب، من خلال أثناء تنفيذنا المشروع. والمؤسسة قامت ببناء قدرات مؤسسات محلية بضمان المشاركة والاستدامة من خلال التشبيك للمؤسسات هذه، وهذا كان مهم جدا بناء قدرات المؤسسات حتى نضمن عملية الاستدامة. شكرا لكم. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Bakir, very much for that presentation on the work that you've been doing in Yemen. And let's now come back to our earlier panelists, to Hitomi. Hitomi, as you listen to the three presentations from Mali, Haiti, and Yemen, and based on the experience that you've had working with the Human Security Trust Fund over many years, what do you think are the main obstacles to addressing human security and gender equality, based on what you were presenting to us earlier as the concept of human security? And do you have maybe a country example that you could share with us where you have been able to overcome some of these challenges to addressing human security and gender in a particularly practical or concrete context? Over to you.
Sure, that's a very good and difficult question to answer, so I'll do my best. I think there's sort of different layers of challenges when we think about trying to advance a human security approach towards, of course, advancing gender equality and women's empowerment in fragile contexts. Some of it is just more practical in terms of knowledge of the approach itself and how to apply it, and then also its value in advancing gender equality and women's empowerment. And I think another area is something that also came through some of the Q&A questions, which was the time and then the practical challenge of investment in the type of depth of analysis necessary to really unpack that kind of nuance. And to understand really what the challenges are on the ground, different forms of intersectionality for different groups, and then being able to bring together the different types of multi-stakeholder partnerships that are really necessary to address these kind of compound challenges. I think in fragile contexts in particular, that can be extremely challenging. I would say across the programs that were represented today, but also some others through the Trust Fund, where we see some movement in this regard and some value in particular in the human security approach really is it's very much focused on a ground up strategy. So really going down to the local level and working up. We saw this definitely both Mali and Haiti programs that even in contexts that were very dynamic, where political situations and the environment was very dynamic, engaging really at that very local level in the assessment process and building on the existing networks and cooperatives that existed at the local level really changed the context in terms of the kinds of information that we received, but also allowed there to be some real concrete improvements in people's lives, even, and maybe the issue of sustainability of those improvements is still important, but even in such a dynamic context. So I think in one example I can think of also was a program in Pakistan that really did a good job of sort of combining, and this is why I was trying to highlight the protection and empowerment strategy. So overcoming those obstacles is also thinking about how we combine issues related to sort of legal protections, access to rights, promotion of rights, with a whole set of, and this was something that also came through the presentations really nicely, a whole set of different types of empowerment-based approaches that are addressing attitudes and beliefs, concrete actions to address sort of economic insecurity as one major entry point, and others, and then creating modes of really meaningful participation and leadership roles for women across these different issue areas. So I hope I answered that well. And I think that also some of our panelists probably have some inputs, valuable inputs in that regard.
Thank you so much. Heriberto, you shared with us earlier the new thinking around the concept of human security, both in terms of the original conceptualization around freedom from want and freedom from fear. How do you see this as you listen to the examples from the three countries? How do you see the advancement of gender equality in terms of this new thinking of the human security concept? And did you find from those three country examples insights that you can use as you put together this new report? Over.
Peter, certainly. I think historically, the gender lens has been extremely useful to see some of the main issues about human security. And I think one of the main points now going forward, and this is valid for everyone, is how to empower people in order to find the best solutions for things that are very complex and for which we don't have a clear pathway right now. So we need to look for the solutions together. And the case of gender equality is precisely one of these cases in which also there is some sort of tensions in the way we are solving the issues. And as a matter of fact, there is an old paper by Caroline Moser that talks about practical needs and strategic needs. So we need some protection in the short term because we need to cover certain basic necessities, food, the very basic level of security. But at the same time, we need to be able to change our environment, the strategic needs. And in many of the presentations, I saw very nicely how there is this transition in which women are in these programs are getting the tools to go also towards the more strategic dimension, and therefore that's going to allow them to, in a sustainable way, shape the society and shape the security for them and their community. So in this sense, I think many of the examples we saw can give us some clue, not only for women and not only for women in the context of fragile settings, but also can give us some ideas about how to think about the future challenges for human security going forward. Over.
Thank you very much, Heriberto. Very nice reflections. Thank you. And I think very much agree with you on watching how in all the projects there was a kind of process of transformation also as women took control of their lives and took leadership positions in their communities as well, in addition to things that were linked to things like livelihood and security and things like that. So I think some good examples there. If I can turn now to our colleague, Mr. Arbi from Mali. I hope you're still with us, sir. A follow-up question for you. You know, as you described in Mali, the security situation has been very volatile in recent years, and yet you've had good results in your project through a focus on community-based stabilization, different initiatives, and obviously also initiatives that focused on improving the quality of women's lives in terms of their livelihoods. Can you share with us, if you would, any reflections or thoughts you might have on how perhaps communal rivalries between different groups, different villages, different communities might have actually derailed or undermined the sustainability of some of the interventions you were making, particularly in terms of livelihood projects or interventions? Over to you, sir.
I believe there's a connection. I think he has disconnected perhaps. I think there's a little issue, Peter. We can go on to the next.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me turn now to Dr. Chandler from Haiti. Are you still with us, Mr. Chandler?
Yes, I am here.
Great, good. Thank you so much, Mr. Chandler. So it was very interesting to hear about the work that you've been doing on helping women and communities to deal with the issue of natural disasters like droughts and floods and things like that, and how women have been more involved in the decision-making processes for disaster risk reduction and disaster response. We also heard about how women have been involved in specializing in disaster risk management, you said, as focal points. Have you found it makes a big difference having women in these decision-making positions at the local level, but also at the national level? And is it enough just to have them represented, or do you need to have sufficient numbers of women involved in these decision-making processes? Because it's all very well to have one or two as representatives, but if you had a larger number of women, has that made a difference in the decision-making, but also in the impact of the initiatives and interventions? Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. I would say that it's both. The answer is both. We need both, and we need to have women at all levels. And when I say all levels, not only in terms of representativity, in terms of numbers, but also from a practical standpoint where they actually act and implement. Because you need to be able to. I don't like to use the concept, but you need to be able to make proof of worth of what you come up with. I mean, we come with the theory that having women involved, having more women involved, will help us and lead us towards more results. Then we need to have more women involved to actually get those results and make sure that what we say it reflects the truth. And the experience has proven also that we have had, like I said, grassroots and community organizations that are led by women that have taken the floor and that have been working. And what we have done is to get their experience and their, I would say, basic knowledge that would be coupled or paired with the scientific processes that we would help them implement or teach them, so we can get more results and have more impact on in terms of results for the community and for empowering women. Now, we also need, we need women at the decision-making level, because the examples that I take are definitely from a practical standpoint or an operational standpoint, they were led by the Ministry of Social Affairs, the Ministry of Women Rights, and also by some other local entities. I'm talking about the municipality and local authorities that were there, that were involved, that understood the cause, that embraced it, and that actually got involved to help the correct implementation of what we came up with in terms of novelty in regards to this project. So yes, like I said, just to sum it up, yes, we need both. We need representativity in terms of decision making. That's for one, but we also need numbers for the implementation, so we can make the proof that it actually works. And so it can help us also grow the base and have more women on board, so we can have more solutions. Over.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chandler. Excellent. I understand Mr. Arby is back with us again. Mr. Arby, are you with us?
Hello, bonjour.
Hello, Mr. Arby. Yes, thank you for joining us again. If I could ask you a question, please, in follow-up to your earlier presentation. Can you hear me okay?
Bon, je n'arrive pas à avoir l'interprétation en français. Hello?
Let me see if I can repeat the question again for Mr. Arby, and then maybe the interpreter can make the question. So the question was about the issue of communal rivalries between different villages and communities in Mali related to the project. I think we might have to go on, Mr. Arby, as I think the quality of the sound is not good enough. Let's move on, if we can, to...
Je voudrais parler d'abord avec la mise en œuvre de ce programme.
Okay, if we could ask our technical colleagues to just maybe disconnect Mr. Arby and then reconnect him, and we'll move on to Ms. Bakir. Ms. Bakir, are you still with us? Ms. Bakir, are you there? Can we have the interpretation, please, if Ms. Bakir is there, so I can ask her a question?
I think there's a technical problem on their end because the interpreter is trying to reach. So perhaps we can just move on. I see that they're on camera, but they're not able to. I think the sound is not coming in.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask Ayako, please, if you'd like to share with us? Oh, you are there, Ms. Bakir. Great. Thank you so much for joining us again. And apologies if there are technical problems. Ms. Bakir, can you tell us a little bit more about the project?
فأنا بيتر ما عرفتش الاسم. اتفضلي ما هو السؤال؟
Of course. So the question is, from the project that you were involved in implementing, can you share with us a little bit more about how you addressed the issue of masculinities and nonviolent conflict resolution? Over to you, please.
قد الآن هي أكبر التحديات التي بنواجه هي العادات والتقاليد. هذه العادات والتقاليد في بعض الأحيان بياخذوها في اتجاه آخر، بيصعب على النساء من الخروج. كما قلت سابقا أن ثقافة العيب هذه موجودة في المجتمعات اليمنية أحيانا، وخصوصا الصراعات والحروب السنوات الماضية هذه عملت على استنقاص في حق المرأة، برغم أن المرأة حاولت أنها قدر المستطاع في أنها تثبت وجودها. الخوف قد يكون من الأوضاع الذي حاصلة. انقطاع الرواتب هذه كمان كانت المشاكل الاقتصادية كبيرة جدا. المشروع لما عمل عملية الاستقرار للنساء عملها من خلال عملية التمكين الاقتصادي كان مهم بالنسبة للأسر عشان نوصل لمرحلة الاستقرار. بالإضافة إلى أنه مشكلة الفراغ الذي كان يعانيها اليمن، وخصوصا أنه في عندنا مشكلة كبيرة وهي عدم توفر الخدمات الأساسية للناس، وخصوصا أن البنية التحتية تهدمت. فاستطاع المشروع أنه يعمل الاستقرار هذا قدر بالشكل المناسب، وإعطاه في الموقع المناسب في فترات زمنية بسيطة جدا. يعني إحنا بنشتغل في الأماكن البعيدة وصعبة التنقل.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bakir. Colleagues, we're now going to move to questions and answers from the panelists, generated from the chat and the Q&A. So Hitumi, I have a question for you, I hope which you can help us with. As you mentioned in your opening presentation, human dignity is one of the most important elements of the human security concept and seems to have become even more important during the COVID-19 period. How do you see gender equality or the gender equality lens from the perspective of human dignity? Over.
So first, I think I would start by responding by saying that there's sort of three elements of human security, actually, that Heriberto nicely laid out: the freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom to live in dignity are part and parcel. You need to be thought about together. So it's not just one aspect to have human security, we need to have all three. From the dignity perspective, we're looking at rights, but also access to opportunities and services, and being able to realize those rights and a person's aspiration in life. And so when we're thinking about promoting gender equality through this human dignity lens, then we would think about, you know, what are the rights in place, first of all, and then are people really able to access them? And that is where some of these elements that we've discussed, that I think every panelist has touched upon in terms of, you know, social norms, attitudes, beliefs become very important in terms of really promoting human dignity, as well as sort of obviously legal and institutional frameworks being available.
Thank you very much, Atumi. Heriberto, any reflections on this as well, on the issue of human dignity versus the freedom from fear and freedom from want?
Yeah, I think it's a very important pillar, because in many cases the freedom from want or freedom from fear, it takes us to things that are very basic and associated with even with our conceptualization of many decades ago. But life is very dynamic, and some of the insecurities that we perceive might not be reflected in certain type of indicators or in the agenda of the 20th century. In order to actually be able to capture what is happening with the real insecurities affecting people and their anxieties, I think having dignity as a lens can help us, and we can see it in particular in the case of gender equality, because there are many things that were kind of accepted just 20 years ago. The people were even, you know, in the people experts were not pushing the agenda to the level that they are today. But now, in the whole issue of representation, when we see, let's say, a picture only with men of leaders, now people react. So it's also an issue of dignity. Even men, we don't want us to see represented only by men, and that has to do with something that we want to be proud of. And gender equality can, through the lens of dignity, can give us some tools to push that agenda. Over.
Thank you, Heriberto. Ms. Bakir from Yemen, are you still with us? Because I have a question for you, please.
Yes, I'm here. نعم أنا هنا.
Thank you so much. So the question to you, Ms. Bakir, is if women have been victims of gender-based violence, how can they be agents of change from being victims of gender-based violence and promoting a transition for women away from being victims of gender-based violence? Over to you.
أحب أوضح بس إنه السبب الرئيسي من عدم تمكن الرجل إنه المرأة تخرج، أو إنه العنف الذي تواجهه المرأة، الخوف من الرجل من القلق إن إذا المرأة استطاعت وتم تمكينها أن تكون هي أكثر مطالبة لحقوقها. وهذا هو المشكلة في الرجل، إنه يمنع من دخولنا في البرامج، يمنع من دخول النساء انخراطهم في العمل. هذا الذي بيؤدي إلى قلقهم، أو إذا فعلا استطاعت الدخول لسوق العمل أو استطاعت أن تكون متمكنة ومستقلة ومستقرة، هنا تشمثل مشكلة بالنسبة له. فكيف تم المعالجة؟ إشراك الرجل مهم في الأدوار هذه. فانتقال الأدوار، فأنا لما حطيت الماتريكس الأدوار المستويات الذي ذكرتها، إحنا بنشتغل مع السلطات الرجال. في إحدى العمل الميداني صدمنا برد النساء في إحدى الأرياف، وهي إنه الرجل السلطة المحلية حبت إنها تعطي نسبة أعلى للذكور ونسبة أقل للنساء. فواحدة من النساء قالت لا، أنت تعطينا مناصفة لأن هذا حق من حقوقنا. فمعنى الحقوق لابد من توعيتها في المناطق، وخصوصا أنه يحتاج لنا وقت طويل لتغيير الثقافات هذه، لإشراك الرجل في برامج النسائية. وهذا الذي استطعنا فيه، والآن إحنا بنشتغل في البرامج إجباري، إن إحنا نفرض في البرامج إنها تكون مناصفة بين الرجل والمرأة. هذا مهم جدا. هنا بيخلي السلطات المحلية واللجان المجتمعية تعمل عملية المشاركة وعملية التشبيك مهم مع المؤسسات الحقوقية، مع المؤسسات المجتمع المدني، مع رجال الدين، مع السلطات المحلية. هذه لازم تكون معنا على أساس إنها تكون قادرة على عملية التوعية النساء من جديد. فهذه الحلول أنا بالنسبة لي أعتبرها حلول مهمة وجوهرية لتمكين المرأة في البداية اقتصاديا. الحرب الآن في اليمن أو عدم الاستقرار في اليمن هي عدم وجود التمكين الاقتصادي. إن وجد التمكين الاقتصادي والاستقرار الاقتصادي ممكن أن يعطى للمرأة حقوقها بشكل أكبر وأن تكون لها دور فاعل والثقة تزيد بين الرجل والمرأة.
Thank you very much. A question for you, Mr. Chandler, maybe just to bring this panel discussion to a close. The issue of violence against women in Haiti is obviously also a big issue. Did your project delve into that issue in any ways, or have you had any experiences in terms of that, or was there a situation where, as women became more empowered in the work that you were doing, did they find themselves victims of violence against from men?
Well, to be clear and direct, we have not dealt directly with violence against women, but what we have witnessed is a problem of perception. As women got involved, as they got more latitude to be able to implement certain actions, it became more and more complicated for them to actually get around and do what needs to be done. So this is a form of violence where they have this opposition that prevents them from doing what they need to do.
Thank you, and I think this is probably thank you, Jerry. This is probably a common issue that we're seeing in many different contexts as well. Colleagues, we're almost at the end of our time, so with your permission, I'm going to turn over now to our final speaker, Mr. Magasaki Kaoru, who's the minister from the Permanent Mission of Japan to the United Nations in New York. You're very welcome, Mr. Magasaki, and thank you for joining us today. And we're going to give you the floor now for a few closing remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bachelor. I should also like to thank all the panelists and the participants in it, and not least the UNDP for this truly enlightening dialogue. I have maintained that gender is a field where a human security approach really matters. Human security focuses on each and every individual, and gender is about dignity and potential of each and every individual. So by following on the needs, vulnerabilities, and the capabilities of each individual in a comprehensive manner, light will be shed on the nexus and the solution that might otherwise be overlooked. This is particularly vulnerable as we look back amidst diverse threats to our lives that we are facing. And what we heard today made these points very clear, in my view. After much articulated presentations on the concepts and context, we had the experiences in Mali, from deprivation in violence to efforts at peace. We had the story in Haiti, preparing and building resilience in facing disasters. We had women in Yemen working to overcome complex traumatic challenges to prepare for livelihood. So to me, it is very evident from what we heard today that a gender equality lens is making things clearer, and with women's participation is making difference. Gender is not a zero-sum game. It unleashes women's potential and creates solutions for the societies and communities in a more safe and prosperous setting. So together with other stakeholders, Japan wishes to continue using it to the maximum extent and to produce tangible results. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Magasaki, for those kind words and for helping us reflect on today's panel discussion. So let me, from our side, from the UNDP side, thank all of you for joining us here today. We've had more than 130 colleagues joining us from around the world, which has been fantastic. We've had a great range of speakers. And although we had some challenges in terms of technology, I think we managed to keep most of the panelists with us. So thank you very much for your perseverance. And of course, it's been wonderful to hear stories from the ground and to hear about the different ways in which the human security concept and approach is being manifested in diverse and complex settings. I think in all the three cases we heard from Mali, Yemen, and Haiti, it's clearly important to continue to focus on leaving no one behind and to continue to push for gender equality and women's empowerment in these very difficult and challenging contexts. As we heard from the Mali colleagues, how women's financial empowerment can be an important counterpart to gender-based violence and strengthen women's ability to work in communities. In Haiti, we learned how women's networks and women's organizations have become involved in strengthening resilience and disaster risk reduction. And finally, in Yemen, we saw how a multi-pronged approach of strengthening social cohesion and addressing harmful masculinities has helped to rebuild disrupted livelihoods and empowered communities to resist and recover from conflict. So in closing, let me reassure you that UNDP will continue to support this work in gender equality, including through a human security lens. And of course, we have the new report to look forward to from the Human Development Report Office very shortly. And that will obviously, I think, give us a really strong emphasis on how the human security lens of the human security concept can be used more powerfully to inform our policy and programming on the ground in supporting gender equality and women's empowerment. So in closing, dear colleagues, we have less than 10 years to go till 2030 and the implementation of the 2030 agenda. And so obviously, I'd like to continue to encourage us all to, in this decade of action, to make continued investments to advance gender equality and women's empowerment. As we know, Goal 5 of the SDGs is an accelerator for the entire 2030 agenda. And we, I think, clearly heard today how the human security approach is the ideal lens through which we can ensure that men and women and children live free from fear, free from want, and free to live in dignity. With that, thank you again for joining us all and see you all very soon. Have a great day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.